The hallway always smelled like old velvet and forgotten dreams. Even after 15 years of working at the Grandview Theater, I still noticed it most at closing time when the last patrons had shuffled out and the building settled into its bones. The scent hung in the air like cigarette smoke from decades past, mixed with the faint sweetness of spilled soda and the metallic tang of the ancient radiators. I pulled the heavy keys from my belt, the same ring I'd carried since my first day here. Each key had a purpose, a locket belonged to, a small responsibility in keeping this place breathing for another night. The stage door, the projection booth, the basement where we stored the old film reels that nobody watched anymore. My hands moved automatically through the routine, muscle memory guiding me through the final sweep of my domain. The popcorn machine had given me trouble earlier. Nothing serious, just a loose belt that needed adjusting, but my fingernails still carried traces of grease beneath them. I'd scrubbed them in the employee washroom, but the smell lingered. It always did. Grease and oil, and the particular kind of dust that accumulates in places where machinery runs day after day, year after year, keeping the magic alive for people who never think about how it happens. I was thinking about the bus ride home. The number 42 that would carry me through downtown, past the construction sites and the late-night diners, to my apartment building where Mrs. Chun will be watching her evening programs with the volume turned up too high. I was thinking about the leftover soup in my refrigerator and whether I had any bread left for tomorrow's breakfast. Simple thoughts, practical thoughts, the kind that filled the spaces between one day and the next. That's when I saw him. At first, he was just a shadow near the side exit, a figure leaning against the brick wall in the dim light that filtered through the alley. I assumed it was someone who'd gotten turned around, maybe looking for the main entrance or trying to find their car. It happens sometimes. People got confused in the maze of narrow streets behind the theater, especially after dark. I was already forming the words in my head, the polite directions I'd give to send them on their way. But then he stepped forward, and the light caught his face, and everything I thought I knew about my small, predictable world shifted sideways. Gabriel Stone. I knew that face the way everyone knew that face. From billboards. From magazine covers and grocery store checkout lines. From movie trailers that played before the old films we showed here, advertising pictures that would never see the inside of the Grandview's aging auditorium. He was the kind of beautiful that belonged on screens, all sharp cheekbones and dark hair that looked effortless even when it was probably styled by someone who made more in a day than I made in a month. But here he was, standing in my alley, wearing a simple black jacket and jeans that looked expensive in the way that good fabric always does. Real. Solid. Waiting. He straightened when he saw me, and his expression was unreadable. Not the practiced smile I'd seen in interviews or the smoldering intensity of his publicity photos. Something more careful, more uncertain. You're Malcolm, right? The words hung in the air between us, and I realized I'd been staring. I've been waiting for you. My name in his mouth sounded strange, like a word in a foreign language that almost made sense. I couldn't imagine a single reason why Gabriel Stone would know my name, let alone why he'd be waiting for me in an alley behind a second-run movie theater on a Tuesday night in October. I looked around, half expecting to see cameras or lights or some indication that this was part of something larger, something that made sense. But there was only the alley, the dumpster, the fire escape ladder that led to the apartments above the dry cleaner next door. The ordinary world I inhabited every day suddenly made extraordinary by his presence, waiting for me. The words echoed in my head as I tried to process what that meant. People didn't wait for me. I was the person who worked while others played, who fixed things while others enjoyed them, who made sure the magic happened while staying carefully invisible. I was 41 years old, and I'd built my life around being unremarkable, unnoticed, uncomplicated. I must have looked confused because something shifted in his expression, a softness around his eyes, like he was seeing something fragile that needed careful handling. Up close, he looked older than he did in movies, more human. There were lines at the corners of his eyes, a small scar on his chin that makeup probably covered for cameras. I realized I should say something. That standing there staring at him wasn't exactly the response he was probably expecting. But the words felt clumsy in my throat, inadequate for the surreal nature of the moment. "I'm sorry," I finally managed. Do I know you?" Even as I asked it, I knew how ridiculous the question sounded. Of course I knew him. Everyone knew him. But I meant it differently, and somehow I thought he understood that. He smiled then, a real smile that reached his eyes, and I felt something shift in my chest. A loosening of tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. "We met before," he said. "A long time ago. In Los Angeles. You probably don't remember." But even as he said it, something stirred in my memory. A flash of recognition that felt like déjà vu, like looking at a photograph from a life I'd almost forgotten I'd lived. The summer I was 26. The summer I thought I might be someone different, someone braver, someone who belonged in places bigger than small towns and broken-down theaters. The summer I learned I was wrong. I did remember, suddenly and completely, a film set in Burbank, hot and chaotic and smelling of sawdust and coffee. I've been working construction then, temporary jobs that paid just enough to keep me alive while I figured out what came next. There'd been a door that wouldn't close properly, and everyone was frustrated, and I'd volunteered to fix it during a break. And there'd been a kid, maybe 20 or 21, sitting alone in a corner between takes. Beautiful even then, but nervous, green around the edges. I made some joke about how the door was just as scared as everyone else, and he'd laughed. We talked for maybe 10 minutes while I adjusted the hinges and tightened the screws. I remembered thinking he seemed lonely, even surrounded by all those people. "You helped me fix that door," he said now, as if he could see the memory clicking into place. "You were the only one who talked to me like I mattered." The weight of that statement settled between us. I studied his face in the dim light, trying to reconcile the frightened kid from my memory with the man standing before me. 15 years. 15 years of his face on every screen, his name in every entertainment magazine, his life dissected and analyzed and celebrated by millions of strangers. And he remembered me. He remembered a maintenance worker who'd spent 10 minutes fixing a door and treating him like a person instead of a commodity. I don't know how long we stood there, looking at each other across the space of years and choices and completely different lives. But something passed between us in that silence, some recognition that went deeper than memory. Like we were both surprised to find ourselves here, in this moment, but not entirely surprised to find each other. The October air was getting colder, and I could feel the weight of my keys in my hand, the responsibility of locking up properly, of keeping the Grandview safe for another night. But for the first time in years, my routine felt less important than the person standing in front of me. I should ask him what he wanted, why he was here, what he needed from me that he couldn't get from the army of assistants and handlers and hangers-on that probably surrounded him most days. Instead, I found myself saying, "You want to get out of the cold?" And when he nodded, something in my carefully ordered world cracked open just enough to let the light in. I led him through the stage door, my keys jingling softly in the quiet. The Grandview felt different with someone else inside after hours, like a house when unexpected company arrives and you suddenly notice all the things you'd stopped seeing. The scuffed linoleum in the hallway. The water stain on the ceiling from last winter's roof leak. The way the fluorescent lights hummed with that particular frequency that meant they'd need replacing soon. Gabriel followed without comment, his footsteps echoing mine on the worn floors. I found myself wondering what he saw when he looked around, whether the shabbiness was charming to someone from his world or just sad. The Grandview had been grand once, back in 1952 when it first opened, all red velvet and gold leaf, and the promise of Hollywood magic delivered to a small city that desperately wanted to believe in something larger than itself. Now it was a relic, not quite historic enough to be protected, not quite profitable enough to be renovated. We showed art house films that 3 people came to see, and classic movies for the handful of elderly patrons who remembered when Jimmy Stewart was young. On good weeks, we broke even. On bad weeks, I watched the owner, Mrs. Patterson, stare at the books with the expression of someone trying to solve an equation that never quite balanced. But it was mine in all the ways that mattered. Every loose floorboard, every temperamental light switch, every quirk and flaw and small victory. 41 years old, and this was the only place I'd ever felt indispensable. I unlocked my office, a cramped space behind the concession stand that had probably been a broom closet in the building's previous life. Gabriel paused in the doorway, taking in the metal desk covered with work orders, the pegboard where I hung my tools, the coffee maker that had been old when I inherited it from my predecessor. A small radio sat on the windowsill, permanently tuned to the classical station that played through my lunch breaks. "It's not much," I said, suddenly conscious of how little I had to offer someone who probably owned houses in multiple countries. He shook his head. "It's perfect." He meant it, I could tell. There was something in his voice, a kind of longing that surprised me. I gestured to the single chair across from my desk, but he remained standing, his hands in his jacket pockets. Up close, in the harsh light of the office, I could see the exhaustion around his eyes, the carefully maintained facade that was starting to crack at the edges. "I live alone," I found myself saying, though I'm not sure why. It seemed important somehow, a fact that defined the shape of my days. A small apartment on Maple Street, 3 blocks from here. Same building for 8 years. The rent was cheap because the windows faced north and the heat was unreliable, but Mrs. Chan next door made soup that smelled like home, and the corner market sold day-old bread for half price if you knew when to ask. I had routines. Morning coffee while listening to the news. The walk to work along streets where I knew which dogs would bark and which crosswalk buttons actually worked. Lunch at my desk, usually a sandwich and whatever fruit was on sale. Evenings with detective novels I borrowed from the library downtown, stories about men who solved mysteries and understood the world in ways I never would. It was a small life, measured in small satisfactions. Fixing the popcorn machine before it broke completely. Replacing a burned-out bulb before anyone complained about the darkness. Keeping the Grandview running so smoothly that no one had to think about the machinery that made their entertainment possible. I didn't go to parties because I was never invited, and I'd stopped minding years ago. I didn't have social media because I couldn't imagine what I'd say to the world or why the world would want to listen. My coworkers knew me as reliable, thorough, and forgettable. The person who fixed things and faded back into the background. Gabriel was still standing there, watching me with an intensity that made me self-conscious. I wondered what he was thinking, whether this glimpse into my ordinary life was fascinating or depressing or both. "You chose this," he said finally, and it wasn't a question. I thought about that. Had I chosen it? Or had it chosen me? Had I deliberately built a life around invisibility, or had invisibility simply been the path of least resistance? "I'm good at it," I said instead. "The work, I mean. I understand how things fit together, how to make them last." "That's rare," he said. "Most people just replace things when they break." There was something in the way he said it that made me think he wasn't talking about machinery anymore. I looked at him more carefully, at the expensive clothes that couldn't quite hide whatever he was running from, at the way he held himself like someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "Why are you here?" I asked, the question that had been building since I saw him in the alley. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. "I've been filming here. Small independent thing, nothing you'd have heard of, and I saw you a few nights ago fixing something backstage. You were completely absorbed in it, like nothing else in the world mattered. And I remembered you. Remembered me from 15 years ago, from 10 minutes of conversation on a film set where I'd been nobody special. The idea seemed impossible and inevitable at the same time. I come here after everyone else goes home," he continued, "to think, to remember what it feels like when nobody's watching. And I kept hoping I'd see you again." The admission hung between us, fragile and honest. I could see the cost of it in his face, the vulnerability of someone who'd learned that honesty was usually a luxury he couldn't afford. Outside, I could hear the distant sound of traffic, the city continuing its late-night rhythms. Inside, the Grandview held us in its familiar embrace of shadows and possibilities. "Do you want some coffee?" I asked because it was the only thing I could think to offer, and because some part of me wasn't ready for him to leave. I made coffee in the ancient machine that had probably been brewing weak coffee since the Carter administration. The ritual gave me something to do with my hands while Gabriel settled into the chair across from my desk. He looked smaller somehow, folded into the cramped space of my office, more human than the larger-than-life figure I'd seen in the alley. The coffee smelled burnt, the way it always did after sitting on a burner too long, but Gabriel accepted the mug I offered without complaint. He wrapped his hands around it like he was cold, though the October night wasn't that harsh yet. "The film I'm working on," he said, staring into the coffee. "It's nothing you'd recognize. Independent drama, tiny budget, the kind of project that gets made because someone believes in the story, not because anyone expects it to make money." He took a sip and winced slightly. I found myself apologizing for the coffee, but he waved it off. "It's perfect," he said again, and I was starting to understand that he meant something different by perfect than most people did. Not flawless, just real. "I've been using the theater after hours," he continued. "The director knows the owner, got permission for me to rehearse here when I need quiet. No crew, no cameras, just me in the space. It's the first time in years I've been able to work without feeling like I'm being watched." I understood that feeling, though for different reasons. The weight of being observed, evaluated, judged. For him, it was the price of fame. For me, it was the fear of it. "That's when I saw you, backstage 3 nights ago. You were fixing something, completely focused. There was this intensity to it, like you were solving the most important problem in the world. And something about the way you moved, the way you held your tools, it was so familiar." The memory was clearer now. That summer in Los Angeles, working construction on sets, the feeling that I was on the edge of something bigger than myself. I'd been younger then, still believing that geography could change who you were, that moving to the right city could unlock some better version of yourself. I remembered the broken door, the way it hung crooked in its frame. A simple problem with a simple solution, but everyone else had been too busy or too important to deal with it. I'd been eating lunch alone, as usual, when I'd heard the director complaining about the delay. "You were sitting by yourself," I said, the memory becoming sharper. "Between takes. You looked like you wanted to disappear." Gabriel smiled, but it was edged with something sadder. I was terrified. It was only my 3rd film, and I kept forgetting my lines. Everyone was so professional, so sure of themselves. I felt like I was pretending to be an actor, and any moment someone would figure it out and send me home. "You asked me about the door," I continued. "Not like you were testing me or trying to prove something. Just curious about how it worked, how I knew what was wrong with it." "You explained it to me like it mattered," he said. "Like I mattered. Most people on set treated me like decoration, something pretty to arrange in front of the camera. But you talked to me like I was just another person trying to do a job well. It hadn't seemed like anything significant at the time. Just a conversation during a lunch break, 2 people finding a few minutes of connection in a place that felt artificial and overwhelming. I'd finished fixing the door, he'd thanked me, and I'd assumed that was the end of it. But apparently it had stayed with him through 15 years of success and recognition and all the complications that came with being Gabriel Stone. The idea was almost impossible to process. "I left Los Angeles 2 weeks later," I said. "It wasn't for me. Too big, too fast, too much pressure to be someone I wasn't." Gabriel nodded like he understood perfectly. "But you remember it. That summer, I remember feeling lost," I admitted. "Like I was trying on a life that didn't fit." "That's exactly how I feel now," he said quietly. "Like I've been wearing someone else's life for so long, I've forgotten what mine looked like." The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. Here was someone who had everything most people dreamed of, admitting that it felt like a costume he couldn't take off. We sat in silence for a moment, drinking terrible coffee in my cluttered office while the grand view settled around us. I could hear the old building's familiar sounds, the radiator clicking, the settling of wood and steel, and dreams that had been holding together longer than they probably should have. "I have an idea," Gabriel said finally. "When I'm done filming here, would you meet me sometimes? After work, I mean. No scripts, no cameras, no expectations. Just talk." The request hung in the air between us, simple and complicated at the same time. I could see what it cost him to ask, the vulnerability of someone who probably didn't know who to trust anymore. "About what?" I asked. "Everything," he said. "Nothing. I don't know. I just know that sitting here with you feels like the first real conversation I've had in months." There was something behind the request that I couldn't quite name. A desperation disguised as casualness. a need that went deeper than loneliness or boredom, like he was drowning in his own success and looking for something solid to hold on to. I should have asked more questions. Should have wanted to understand what he was really asking for, what he expected from someone like me. But instead, I found myself nodding. Okay, I said, we can do that. The relief in his face was so immediate and profound that I wondered if I'd just agreed to something much more significant than coffee and conversation. But it was too late to take it back, and looking at him, I wasn't sure I wanted to. Our meetings began simply enough. Thursday nights, after the last show ended, and the building emptied of patrons and staff. Gabriel would wait by the stage door, hands in his pockets, looking like any other person seeking shelter from the October chill. But there was nothing ordinary about the way my pulse quickened when I saw his silhouette in the dim light. We'd lean against the edge of the stage, our voices carrying in the empty auditorium. The seats stretched before us in neat rows, worn velvet catching the ghost light I left burning for safety. It was the only illumination we needed, that single bare bulb on its metal stand, casting everything in soft shadows. At first, Gabriel talked about his work the way people do when they're trying to fill silence. Stories about film sets and early morning calls, about directors who changed their minds 20 times in costumes that looked beautiful but felt like armor. There was a practiced quality to these stories, like he'd told them before at dinner parties and interviews, polishing them until they gleamed with just the right amount of self-deprecation and insider knowledge. But gradually, the performance began to fall away. He told me about the private jet that felt more like a flying prison, about how he'd stopped looking out the windows because all airports looked the same, about hotel rooms in cities whose names blurred together, each one decorated with the same generic paintings and stocked with the same expensive amenities that meant nothing. He described a party in Malibu where everyone knew his name, but no one seemed to know him, where conversations felt like transactions and every laugh was calculated. About the way people looked at him in restaurants, not with recognition, but with appraisal, as if they were trying to determine his current market value. I found myself laughing more than I had in years, not at the glamour, but at the absurdity. The way he described having to wear a disguise to buy groceries, only to be recognized anyway, because his disguise consisted of sunglasses and a baseball cap, the universal uniform of celebrities trying not to be noticed. The time he'd spent 3 hours in makeup to look like he hadn't slept for a scene about insomnia that lasted 30 seconds on screen. My own stories felt small by comparison, but Gabriel listened to them with the same attention I'd once given to that broken door in Los Angeles. I told him about the night the old projection system finally died during a screening of Casablanca, and how I'd managed to jury-rig a replacement using parts from 3 different decades of equipment. About the time I'd found a family of raccoons living in the basement, and how it had taken 2 weeks of patient coaxing to relocate them without traumatizing the mother. I described the particular satisfaction of fixing something that seemed hopeless, the way a broken machine could become a puzzle waiting to be solved. How I'd learned to listen to the building's sounds, to know when the furnace was working too hard or when the roof was developing a new leak. The intimacy of understanding something so completely that you could predict its failures before they happen. Gabriel would ask questions that surprised me, not about the technical details, but about why I cared so much about keeping everything running. What it felt like to be the person responsible for making sure other people's experiences went smoothly. Whether I ever resented being invisible, essential but unnoticed. I never thought about it that way before. The invisibility had always felt like protection, not sacrifice. But talking to him, I began to see it differently. Not as hiding, but as a choice I'd made so consistently that it had become who I was. As the weeks passed, something shifted in our conversations. Gabriel spoke less about the surface of his life and more about the loneliness underneath. The way he'd learned not to trust compliments because they were usually prefaced to a request. How he'd stopped believing in spontaneous kindness because everything in his world was managed, orchestrated, designed to serve someone's agenda. He talked about waking up in beautiful places and feeling empty, about being surrounded by people whose livelihoods depended on keeping him happy, but who disappeared the moment their contracts ended. about the growing certainty that if he stripped away the fame and the money and the carefully constructed image, there might be nothing left that was genuinely his. I began to notice things about him that the cameras probably never caught. The way his eyes crinkled when he was telling the truth, staying perfectly smooth when he slipped into performance mode. How he'd touch his forehead when he was thinking, an unconscious gesture that made him look younger. The careful way he asked questions, as if he was afraid the answers might disappoint him. More importantly, I noticed how I felt during our conversations. More alert, more present than I'd been in years. I found myself planning my work differently, finishing tasks earlier so I could linger without rushing. Anticipating Thursday nights in a way that surprised me with its intensity. I was changing, though I couldn't have articulated how. Something was opening in me that had been closed for so long I'd forgotten it existed. Not hope, exactly, but something like curiosity about what came next. And Gabriel was changing too. The practice charm was giving way to something more genuine, more fragile, more real. It was a Thursday in early November when everything changed. The theater had been quieter than usual that night. Only a handful of people for the 7 o'clock showing of an old Hitchcock film. I'd finished my rounds early, checking the radiators that would need more attention as the weather turned colder, replacing a burnt-out bulb in the lobby that had been flickering for days. Gabriel was waiting by the stage as always, but something was different. He stood with his back to me, staring up at the empty balcony, his shoulders tense in a way I'd learned to recognize. When he turned, I could see the exhaustion etched deeper than usual around his eyes. We took our familiar positions at the edge of the stage, but tonight he didn't launch into stories or ask about my day. Instead, he sat in silence, picking at a loose thread on his jacket sleeve with the kind of focused intensity that meant his mind was somewhere else entirely. "Everything okay?" I asked, though it was obvious everything wasn't. He looked at me, then really looked as if he was trying to memorize something he was afraid of losing. "They wanted to do the talk show circuit," he said finally. 3 weeks of interviews about the new film. Morning shows, late night, podcasts, the whole machine. That didn't sound unusual. I'd seen enough entertainment news to know that promoting films was part of his job, as routine as oil changes were part of mine. But Gabriel continued, his voice getting quieter. "They've been hounding me about it for weeks. My publicist, my manager, the studio executives. Everyone has an opinion about what I should say, how I should say it, which stories will play well with which demographics." He ran his hands through his hair, messing up the careful styling that probably cost more than I made in a week. "The problem is there's not a single person in those rooms I actually want to tell the truth to." I understood then. It wasn't about the interviews themselves, but about the performance they required. The careful construction of a public self that bore less and less resemblance to whoever he really was underneath. "What would you tell them?" I asked. "If you could tell the truth." Gabriel was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. The old theater settled around us, wood and steel and memory creaking in the November chill. Finally, he spoke, his words barely above a whisper, that I'm tired of being looked at but not seen. That I wake up every morning wondering if anything I do actually matters, or if I'm just a very expensive puppet dancing for people's entertainment. That I've been surrounded by so many people whose jobs depend on keeping me happy that I've forgotten what honest feedback feels like. He paused, then added that the only real conversations I've had in months have been sitting here with you. The admission hung between us, fragile and dangerous. I could feel the weight of it, the trust he was placing in me by saying it out loud. But there was something else in his voice, something that made my heart beat faster. "And you tell me?" I asked. The question came out more vulnerable than I'd intended, exposing something I hadn't meant to reveal. Gabriel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up and moved closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to notice that his hand was shaking slightly. "Malcolm," he said, and my name and his voice sounded different than it ever had before. Less careful, more urgent. I should have asked what he was doing. Should have reminded him that I was nobody special, just a maintenance worker who fixed broken things and lived quietly and had never been the kind of person who attracted attention from anyone, let alone someone like him. Instead, I found myself standing too, closing the small distance between us without consciously deciding to move. He cupped my face with both hands, his palms warm against my skin, and looked at me with an intensity that made me feel like I was the only person in the world. For a moment, we just stood there, breathing each other's air, balanced on the edge of something that would change everything. Then he kissed me. It was hesitant at first, almost questioning, as if he was asking permission even as he took it. His lips were softer than I'd expected, gentler than the confident way he carried himself suggested. When I didn't pull away, when I leaned into him instead, the kiss deepened into something that felt like relief and desperation and coming home all at once. My heart stumbled in my chest, a rhythm I'd never felt before. Every rational thought I might have had disappeared, replaced by the simple fact of Gabriel's mouth on mine, his hands in my hair, the way he made a small sound against my lips that suggested he was as surprised by this as I was. When we finally broke apart, we stayed close, foreheads touching, both of us breathing hard. I'm not sure whether to step closer or retreat, I whispered, because it was the truth, and because lying to him felt impossible in that moment. Gabriel smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him all evening. "Don't retreat," he said. "Please don't retreat." But even as he said it, I could see the fear in his eyes. The knowledge that whatever this was between us, it existed in the space between his world and mine, and that space was smaller and more fragile than either of us wanted to admit. The kiss changed everything and nothing. We still met on Thursday nights, still sat on the edge of the stage, talking while the ghost light cast its pale circle around us. But now there was a current running underneath our conversations, an awareness that made every accidental touch feel electric, every shared laugh more significant. Gabriel's filming was winding down. I could see it in the way he talked about his days, the references to final shots and wrap parties, and the logistics of moving on to the next project. 2 weeks, he'd mentioned casually the previous Thursday, as if the timeline was just another detail instead of a countdown to the end of whatever this was between us. I found myself paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. The way he rubbed his temple when he was tired. How he always sat with one leg drawn up, like he was ready to bolt if necessary. The careful way he watched my face when he told me about his world, as if he was looking for signs of judgment or disappointment. But it was my sister Vanessa who forced me to confront what was happening. She'd stopped by the theater on a Friday afternoon, ostensibly to drop off soup she'd made too much of, but really because she had that look in her eyes that meant she'd been thinking about me more than usual. Vanessa was 3 years younger, but had always been the one with her life figured out. Married to David for 12 years, 2 kids who actually seemed to like her, a job teaching elementary school that she approached with the same methodical patience she'd shown when helping me with homework 20 years ago. She found me in the basement, replacing a filter in the ancient furnace that kept the building marginally warm. I was grateful for the distraction of the work, the familiar weight of tools in my hands, and a problem with a clear solution. "You've been different lately," she said without preamble, settling onto an upturned crate while I worked. "Different how?" I asked, though I knew exactly what she meant. "Distracted. Happier, maybe, but also more anxious. Like you're thinking about something all the time." I tightened a connection that didn't need tightening, buying myself time to think. Vanessa had always been able to read me better than anyone, a skill that had been both comforting and terrifying throughout her childhood. "I met someone," I said finally, because lying to her had never worked anyway. She raised an eyebrow. "That's good news, isn't it?" "I don't know. It's complicated." "Complicated how?" The question hung in the dusty air of the basement while I tried to figure out how to explain Gabriel without explaining Gabriel. How to describe falling for someone whose life existed in a completely different universe from mine. "He's not from here," I said eventually, "and he's leaving soon." Vanessa was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Where's he going?" "Los Angeles. Back to his life. Back to his real life. And you can't go with him?" The question was so simple, so direct, that it caught me off guard. Could I go with him? The possibility had hovered at the edges of my consciousness for weeks, but I'd never let myself examine it directly. "I'm not sure I can be that person," I said. "Not in his world." "What person?" "Someone who belongs in that kind of life. Someone who's comfortable being seen, being noticed." Someone who has something to offer besides the ability to fix broken things. Vanessa looked at me with the expression she probably used on her students when they were being particularly dense. Malcolm, she said, you realize that's exactly what some people need, right? Someone who fixes broken things. But she didn't understand the scale of the difference between us. Gabriel's world was red carpets and first-class flights, and people whose entire careers revolved around managing his image. I was a maintenance worker who lived in a rented apartment and bought day-old bread and had never owned anything worth insuring. That night, our last Thursday before filming wrapped, Gabriel was waiting for me as always. But something was different in his posture, a tension that suggested he'd been rehearsing what he wanted to say. We settled into our usual spots, but he didn't start talking immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, expensive paper with his name embossed in the corner. I have something to ask you, he said, his voice careful in the way it got when he was trying to control the outcome of a conversation. Inside the envelope was a plane ticket. Los Angeles International Airport, departing the Monday after his filming wrapped. My name printed neatly in the passenger field. If you don't come with me, I'll understand, he said quickly, as if the words had been building pressure inside him for days. But I had to ask. I had to know if this thing between us, whatever it is, if it's strong enough to survive outside this place. I stared at the ticket, at the tangible proof that he wanted me in his life beyond these stolen Thursday nights. But I could also see what it represented. The choice between the safety of invisibility and the terror of being seen. Between the predictable satisfaction of my small life and the unknown complications of his larger one. Gabriel was watching my face, and I could see the hope and fear warring in his expression. He'd made himself vulnerable by asking, and now he was waiting for me to either accept or reject, not just the invitation, but him. I stood there in the dim light of the theater, feeling the pull of both choices. The ticket in my hands felt like it weighed nothing and everything at the same time. I didn't give Gabriel an answer that night. I took the ticket, felt its weight against my fingers, and told him I needed time to think. He nodded like he'd expected as much, but I could see the disappointment he was trying to hide behind understanding. The filming wrapped 3 days later. I watched from my office window as trucks loaded equipment, as crew members who'd become familiar faces over the past month said their goodbyes and dispersed back to whatever projects waited for them next. Gabriel was there, shaking hands and embracing people with the practiced grace of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. But his eyes kept finding my window, and when our gazes met across the parking lot, I felt that same electric current that had been running between us since our first kiss. He raised one hand in a small wave, a gesture so simple and human that it made my chest tight. Then he was gone, and the grand view settled back into its familiar rhythms, as if the past month had been a dream. Weeks passed. November gave way to December, and the theater took on the particular quietness of winter. Fewer patrons braved the cold for our evening showings, and I found myself with more time to think than I wanted. The ticket sat on my kitchen table, moved aside for meals, but never put away, a constant reminder of a choice I still hadn't made. I tried to return to my old routines. Morning coffee while listening to the news. The walk to work along streets where frost made everything look different, but somehow the same. Lunch at my desk with whatever sandwich I'd thrown together that morning. But everything felt slightly off-kilter, like a machine whose timing had been disturbed. The posters for Gabriel's film appeared everywhere in December. Movie theaters, bus stops, the sides of buildings. His face looked back at me from a dozen different angles as I moved through the city, always perfectly lit, always composed. I wondered if he looked at those posters and recognized himself, or if they felt like images of a stranger wearing his features. I never went to see the film. I told myself it was because I didn't want to watch him perform when I'd grown used to seeing him simply be himself. But the truth was more complicated. Seeing him on screen would make his absence more real, would remind me that while I was fixing radiators and replacing light bulbs, he was somewhere else entirely, living a life I couldn't imagine. One evening in mid-December, after locking up the theater, I found a package waiting in my office. Small, unmarked, no return address. Inside was a brass key, old and tarnished, the kind that might have opened doors in buildings like the Grandview decades ago. Beneath it, a note written in handwriting I recognized even though I'd only seen it once before on the plane ticket that still sat on my kitchen table. For whenever you decide you want to see the other side of the door. No signature, no explanation of what door he meant or where the key might fit. But I understood anyway. It wasn't about a literal door. It was about the choice between staying safe and taking a risk, between the familiar territory of my small life and the unknown landscape of whatever waited beyond it. I stood alone in my office, the key heavy in my palm despite its size. Around me, the theater hummed with its usual nighttime sounds, the settling of old wood, the whisper of heat moving through ancient pipes, the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. All the sounds that had been the soundtrack to my life for 15 years. I thought about Gabriel somewhere in Los Angeles, probably in a house that looked nothing like my cramped apartment, surrounded by people whose names I'd recognize from magazines. I wondered if he thought about our Thursday nights, about the conversations we'd had in the circle of the ghost light, about the way kissing me had seemed to surprise him as much as it had surprised me. I thought about Vanessa, asking why I couldn't be the person who fixes broken things in his world too, about the possibility that what I saw as limitations he might see as exactly what he needed. The key felt warm now, heated by my palm and my uncertainty. I could keep it, put in a drawer with other small objects that marked moments in my life. Let it become another memory, another story about a road not taken. Or I could trust that sometimes the most important doors open not because you're ready, but because you're brave enough to turn the key. I slipped it into my pocket, where it settled against my leg like a small weight, a reminder of choices still unmade. Outside, December snow was beginning to fall, dusting the empty streets with possibility. For the first time in years, I couldn't predict what tomorrow would bring. And instead of terrifying me, that uncertainty felt like the beginning of something I'd been waiting for without knowing I was waiting. The future stretched ahead of me, no longer an empty hallway, but a door I might choose to open.